Hello, everyone, and welcome to the EVN Disrupt podcast. My name is Nishdat Zaldurian. I'm the editor of the tech section here at EVN Report. My guest today was Adam Bittlingmayer, the co-founder and CEO of ModelFront, a machine translation quality prediction company. We spoke about his early days on the Google Translate team, how machine translation has developed over the last 15 years, and how ModelFront informs translators of which pieces of a machine translated text to focus on in the post-editing process. At the end, we also spoke about the recent debates over AI accelerationism versus decelerationism. Thank you for listening. Adam, thank you so much for coming on.
Great to see you again.
Let's start from the Google Translate days. I know you were one of the early members of the Google Translate team. Tell us when you were working there and what translation looked like back then.
So I joined Google right out of college in 2007. My goal, just with a bachelor's degree, I was 22, and my goal was always to go to Google Translate. It sort of made a lot of sense. I'm a, language guy at heart.
Polyglot.
Yeah. As you know, I think you're also a language guy.
I know 2. Doesn't compare to your 6 or 7, I think. 8, sorry.
And I was a software engineer. I studied computer science in Seattle. And so, totally made sense. Hey, and this was 2007, right? And so, I got there. I didn't go to that team immediately. I was on Android fairly early on. And then by 2010, I had made it to Google Translate within Google Research.
Mm-hmm. Back in 2007, I can't remember when Google Translate became a consumer product. Was it released already in 2007 or?
So more or less what happened was you had rules-based systems going back to the 70s even, Systran and so on. And if you remember, I think you're too young to remember, but there was something called Babelfish in the 90s.
I do remember Babelfish, yeah.
That was what we all used. I remember my father saying, hey, come look at this, right? And that was the rules-based era. And that roughly lasted, well, that was in force around the year 2000. And then by 2005, basically, these PhD projects, sort of coming out of the University of Aachen in Germany, had jumped over to the West Coast and became the new way of doing translation. So statistical methods. Mm-hmm. So they learn from data. If you want to call it AI or not, that's an open question. But that really started, around 2005. 2000 to 2005 was that transition.
And Google Translate became like a publicly available product around then as well?
Yeah, already by 2005, certainly.
So by the time you graduated, you had already used it and you had seen Google
For
Translate.
me, you look at me now, you say I was an early guy there, but for me, I was a late guy. I was the youngest guy on the team, and these were the people who had made this revolution happen.
Right. Even going back a little bit further, why do you like languages so much? Why learn 7, 8 languages?
It was definitely never a plan. I'm extremely lazy. I have my way of learning, and I don't spend a lot of effort. And I think anybody who really is good at something, whether it's soccer or whether it's business or whatever, learning languages, really the trick is that they put in the work on the right things. So that's just how it is for me, that I don't put that much effort. I see people all the time when I see someone learning a language, they put way more effort than I have. Just to learn 8, they put more effort to learn 1, and they still don't learn it. And the reason is because they're focusing on the wrong things, not because they have lower brain capacity or something.
So you had figured out like an optimal 80-20 of how to learn languages.
Yeah.
What is that?
So you probably know about a Zipfian distribution, right? Uh-huh. So, right, you got a few most common words, and then it drops off quickly after that, right? And invariably, if you go to someone who's struggling with a language, maybe one that I already speak fluently, and they're struggling to get there, and you say, okay, let's see, like, what did your teacher give you, or what is Duolingo having you do? And there's a bunch of words in there that I don't know. Now, how is it that you're spending time on these words when you don't have the basic fluency and conversational stuff, really nailed down, right? And it's a false agenda. And
I remember
there are a few more tricks, but that's the main thing.
I remember Tim Ferriss had this like list of sentences that he would learn when trying to learn any language. And it covered like the basic, the most frequently used, not only vocabulary, but phrases to get you by on stuff. And by learning that, you really like expedited the learning process of the rest.
That's a good one for sure. But I would say that you sort of inevitably, if you do that and you're starting from this one side, then you really want the frequency distribution in the target language. So
because it's different for each
yeah,
language.
maybe if I given an Armenian example, right? If you take your English list and you translate it into all the languages, you're never going to get Salvatanam because, you know, but if you're saying, okay, what would help me survive in the most situations? Well, that's a word that you can use all the time.
Sure.
It can mean anything. And you've now avoided learning a bunch of other words, right?
Yeah.
Like, sorry, I hit your car, or, hey man, can I ask you something? It's all the same.
Right.
And now you've just covered so much of daily life.
I also find, like sometimes I see here in Armenia when they're teaching English, they teach these like overly formal, proper things that even as a native English speaker, I've never heard in my life.
Right.
And it shows you that like language learning maybe sometimes is so academic that it becomes impractical. Right?
That's another one, right? So it's all about the teacher and his or her ego complexes and so on, right? And not, I mean, soap operas and pop songs actually work really well. And that may not make the teacher happy because, that's, for the cultures I hold near and dear, yes, I'm not always happy what's going on in those spheres, but actually that is what people need, what the students need, to survive.
Yeah, the practicality of it is sometimes missing. So let's get back to Google Translate. So when you joined, it was the statistical methods revolution was taking place. What were you guys working on then past that? Did you stick around for the deep learning phase or?
I quit right before the deep learning phase. And you talk about like AI winters. I would say that in some sense, machine translation was in a winter, roughly 2012, 2013. And sort of the reason for why I call it that was like, okay, they had figured out this amazing sort of process for launching new languages. So I think one thing that Google and Microsoft have done very well is launch more languages, right? If you look over the last 10 years, that's what they keep doing. And then you got to have the parsers for all of them and all of this stuff, right? And there were sort of noises and feelings back then that, hey, this isn't scalable and there has to be something where this stuff is all just kind of learned. But that's sort of the state where it was. And we were very much focused on, let me call it delivery or distribution, right? Me specifically, I was maintaining the Google Chrome, Google Translate integration, right? And Chrome is also on Android, which was the team I had come from. And, at that time, again, when I joined Android, I don't know how, it was maybe a few 100,000 people or something or less using an Android phone.
Right.
And right now you have 4 billion people using an Android phone. You have 6 billion people who don't understand English on Earth, right? Most of them are now online, roughly 75% of the people on the internet. Don't understand English. They don't have a computer like a desktop. They have an Android phone, right? They don't have an iPhone typically. And every time they run over a web page that's not in their language, this thing is just automatically translating for them. And if you didn't have that, they basically wouldn't be able to understand 95 to 99% of the internet, depending on what their mother tongue is, because it's only for the very top languages that you even have 5% of the internet in that language.
Yeah. English speakers really don't see that perspective because we're used to just being able to get whatever information we want on the web through that, right?
Exactly. It's a total blind spot, but we are basically in this elite, roughly 20%
of the world
of the internet users. Of the world, it's even a bit smaller.
Yeah. Right. I think another interesting thing about Google Translate is for a lot of people, it was probably their first time using an AI product, even without knowing they were. It wasn't called AI back then, just right.
Yes.
Right, but it was something we all used in like the late 2000s, early 2010s.
Yeah, I like to say that if Google Search launched now instead of back when it did, or roughly around the year 2000, that it would be called AI, even if it worked exactly the same.
Yeah. Good point. Yeah, the definitions have gotten a little bit slimy over the years.
Right.
Okay, so the deep learning revolution came, and we all at one point or another started seeing a significant improvement in how Google Translate worked. I remember there was this famous New York Times article profiling the Google Translate team and the integration of deep learning systems into there. This was like 2015, 2016, probably.
2016,
yeah. And then along came the idea for ModelFront. Was that right? Or did we miss a step in between?
We probably missed a step. So, even back in like 2012 or something, I was always very frustrated with the idea that we would serve up sometimes terrible translations, and you remember back then how it was, and it was very finicky, right? And I said, we have to be able to tell the user that this is bad, like this one is bad, right? There's a lot that are subjective, maybe bad, but there's some of them were really bad back then. And I always compared it a little bit to Google search. So with a search, right, if you go just put some junk in there, it'll say, sorry, no results found. There's literally no page on the entire internet, out of billions of pages, there's no page that contains this string. Mm-hmm. And translation never tells you that. Machine translation never comes back and says, sorry, I can't translate that.
It always gives something.
Right? Whereas a human would, a human translator, right? And so this paradigm, I found suboptimal when I compared it to search engines, right? We were in a search company. At that point, we moved from Google Research to Google Search, and we're in B43, right? Sitting below Larry and Sergey, and search is all around you, right? And we're this, 15, 20 person team within search. Say, look, the other products they're giving you back 10 results, and then you choose one. Mm-hmm. And, or if there's really no result and doesn't know what to do, it returns no result, right? And, search, for example, would do, if you would say, I don't know, in Italian, this was something pointed out to me by Jakob Uskreit, who then went on to invent the transformer. He said, look, if you go to Google Images and you type like machina in Russian or machine in Persian, mekana in Armenian, right? It shows you a picture of a car by default. And if you go to Google Translate, right, and you type in that, it was translating as machine. And it still is. Some of these things, I haven't looked today, but last time I checked, it was still like that, right? And so his point was, our systems know that, our other systems, our image search system understands that most people in that language, when they say basically machine, they mean a car, right? Just like the word car for us doesn't mean a horse-drawn cart, it means a car. Yeah, and so there was definitely that sort of idea back then with me, and I did start working on some things around quality, basically saying, okay, can we say when we have done this sort of total fail, or very likely made it a wrong translation?
Yeah, translation kind of got a pass because it was still perceived to be so far out of the, like, Strong's translation was perceived to be so far out of the capabilities of computers that they were like, well, it's a computer, it's doing the best it can, kind of, right?
Yeah, there's also a lot of, I'd say, fundamentally blind spots. So those of us who speak English, we don't really need this thing. And most of the traffic in the consumer world is going in the other direction. And a lot of us, we just kind of look at it, oh, look, Chinese characters, it translated. Right? Oh, Russian characters. Yeah. And we don't really actually have to use these things very much. Right. I was, recently working with my daughter, she's 7, on learning to program, and you go to something like code.org, and the translations are, machine translation, and it's really unusable. And the only reason that you can understand the translation is because, it's only really accessible for a kid whose father is a programmer and used to work at Google Translate, which is the system that it was translated with, and knows what the English probably was that caused this terrible translation, right? But for most kids, that means effectively code.org is not accessible. Right. Most kids on Earth. Right. They can't learn to program.
When you scale that to the amount of people that would want to use any platform, not just code.org, it's a massive, massive problem. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Why wasn't quality prediction and things like that built into Google Translate earlier? Why wasn't it a priority?
Right. It was an interesting question.
Not just Google Translate, right? Big companies in general.
Very interesting question. I came to the conclusion, actually, that, so if you look at what we do, we basically work with large companies that have been, translating millions of lines of their own content. And the way they do it is they first machine translate, and then they have humans look at, professionals really look at every single line, and they change some of them and they don't change others. And if you go back, like, this started actually in the year 2000. Is the earliest I've heard of it, probably before, but Sun Microsystems in the Valley was using this method of translation back in the year 2000 or so, 2002 maybe. And this became the standard over, the 2010s, basically, and definitely with the transformer and neural machine translation 2015, 2016, 2017, it accelerated. And so my view is that once a large chunk of those translations are perfect, it used to be 20%. Now I kind of see an industry average of like 50%, but once it's 80 or 90%, just simply insane. It's unsustainable that we send something off to an agency or off to a professional translator, and he or she wastes 90% of his time looking at things that don't need to be looked at, right? And so that's the main driver. So did AI get maybe easier to build? Yes, right? But I think the value drives everything. And even if AI were not easy to build, if you have enough value there, then, we technologists, we builders will find a way. So that's, in my view, it's the number of good translations. Whereas if you had a quality score in like 2010 for a professional high value bit of content, you would have had to simply say every sentence is bad. Right. And that's not very interesting.
Right. It's also not in the interest of the translation software providers, I guess.
Maybe there was just no value there. There's a question about what's in their interest too, but I think maybe the question isn't why they didn't do it, but like why somebody else didn't do it, and the reason somebody else didn't do it. So what the early research on this back in that era was actually used for the opposite thing, which is when should I give the translator the machine translation to edit from versus just have it be empty because the machine translation is so bad that they're better off writing from scratch.
Interesting.
Right? But that's much less valuable.
Right. So we just got to a point where AI was good enough where it's now worth it and applicable to use for large scale translation services.
Though I would say, I was having a conversation last night with a tech company, security company, and you go look and it's still not performing that great for them. I would say the biggest bottleneck for me, and there you kind of have to say sorry, like maybe go customize this or go fix this or that, and then we'll actually be able to provide a lot of value for you. So I would say still this is the bottleneck, that there aren't that many good translations to approve for all sorts of high value content. That
many good translations, meaning that the translation provided by the AI system is just too weak and requires too much work?
Yeah. So my way of viewing this is like, does this sentence require any change or not? Very simple, just very binary.
Yeah. So let's talk about the workflow for ModelFront. Walk us through how somebody uses ModelFront to accelerate the process of translation.
So if you look in how this translation workflow is done today, right? This is basically what we're talking about, is like the first workflow to adopt sort of AI for text generation, right? Their workflow is the following. They first get the document, then they have what's called the translation memory, something from the 90s. It goes and looks, hey, were any of these sentences already translated before? If so, just use that old translation.
Okay, that's interesting. That's something you guys have internally?
No, it's something that they have that our customers have internally, right? And then they have had that for 10 or 20 years. And then they machine translate. So the system gets the machine translations and inserts those. And previously then the linguists, the translators would go to work. Right? And now with ModelFront, after that machine translation step, there's sort of another step very analogous to that translation memory step, which again looks for segments that are already perfect and don't require further analysis, editing or looking. Yeah. And so what a translator receives then, just like before, is they're receiving whole documents, but many of the sentences are already done. They're there for context, but they can basically skip those and go to those that need work and just look up and down for context if they need it. So it's just, it's not really changing anything for them, except that the number of those has increased on average. The number of context segments has increased relative to the amount of work.
So it filters down the parts of the text that need a human eye to look at.
Right.
And the system is reliable enough that the parts where you don't need a human eye to look at, they trust that we can just accept this as it is, kind of thing.
I would say they don't trust.
Yeah.
They test.
Right.
And then they see that that's the case. So yeah, nobody trusts this because, and they shouldn't.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So this part of the process is called post editing.
Right. This workflow is generally referred to as post editing. Yeah.
How much time does that save using ModelFront?
So it's really driven by the number of translations that are perfect, right? So, if 20% of the translations are perfect, then we can save a good chunk of that. So that ends up being like 10% of the total. Now that's not that exciting, right? But there are other cases where 90% are being, used as is. And then, you can save 80%, right? And there are other types of documents where it's even higher, 95, 99%, right? And there you can get nearly 90% can be approved as is with no perceptible drop in quality.
How many language pairs does this work for?
So that goes back to this thing about what technology may be enabled versus demand. We really started at a time when it became possible to do everything for the top 100 languages. And so we built things from day one to fully support the top 100 languages, including Armenian, of course, and all language pairs, so 10,000 combinations.
In this case, does the language pairing particularly important, or could systems be developed that just catch bad language? Well, I guess in the context of language, now that I think in translation specifically, there could just be a literal bad translation, whereas the text that's outputted is grammatically correct, but it's an incorrect translation of what the original meaning was.
Right. So you have in translation, and I think you can apply this to let's say ChatGPT as well. You always have these two dimensions of quality, which are fluency and accuracy. So you can catch some disfluencies, which just only looking at the target or only looking at the source, you can catch disfluencies. But then accuracy, you really have to look at both the source and the translation.
Right. How applicable is this tech to other forms of AI generated or AI automated context? For example, like you have that problem with code generation too, right? I tell ChatGPT to write me this project. I need to go sit down and like manually review it. It's a little bit easier than translation because I can write tests and stuff to catch stuff, but I still need to manually look at it. So is this text maybe applicable to other spaces of AI as well?
Right. I think basically translation already has it has these translation management systems. It's chunking everything into segments. You have, 3,000 translation agencies doing more than $1 million a year, right? So it's, you have this whole ecosystem. You have a price per word payment model and everything. And so, you can kind of look to translation and see what'll happen in these other spaces. They may be different for various reasons, but I think ultimately as a programmer myself, yes, if I get some code that I have to look at, I'd much rather if somebody could point out to me the parts that they were not sure about, and leave the boring parts out, right? So I think that'll ultimately happen. But I think probably the closest analogy to translation would simply be speech recognition. So like transcribing this interview, it's exactly the same workflow. First, you have these transcriptions. It always messes up on the most interesting words because they're the ones that are sort of break the language model. And then somebody has to go listen through an hour to go fix maybe 10 key points, right? But they're important.
Yeah, that's a good example.
So that's the most similar. And then speech-to-speech translation is a sort of blend of those two. So those ones are very obvious, but I think all of these areas that are emerging now with the sort of horizontal spread of transformer-based models, there will be more good opportunities for this. But as it currently stands, I would say that in some sense, the ecosystems don't exist yet to do it. Like you couldn't go do it today because they actually don't have the data. They don't have these workflows set up.
Right. Even for code?
Code is one that evolves fast. We programmers are very spoiled, so we always get shiny stuff first because we kind of demand it.
With code, I guess, like I feel like the way most people are using AI for code generation is still something like Copilot, which is much more akin to kind of an autocomplete, which makes it easier to manually inspect because you do it in small chunks and you're totally controlling the workflow. Whereas with GPT, if you're just telling it to write something from scratch, then you're going to have more problems. But I imagine something's cooking in that space for sure.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the fact that it has the whole context of the program that this person is working on really helps. And yes, that should be, it makes sense to use that.
And code is much more of a controlled space than human language, right? Than translation.
I would agree.
Yeah, it's an easier problem in some ways. What about just for like general natural language generation, like people using it to write articles and things like that?
Yeah, to me it makes sense that in every article you have basically the parts that are pretty non-controversial, and then the parts where, hey, this is the one I'd like the editor's input on, right? Yeah, and based on the input. So it really, I think, depends on how you generated the article.
Yeah, but going back to your point, still doesn't compare to the volume that translation competes with. Just from a perspective, like an article might be 1,500, 2,000 words if it's long, whereas translation might be pages and pages and pages.
I think it's hard to say. There's a lot of content that's written. Most of it doesn't get translated. When it does get translated, though, it's often being translated into 10 or 100 languages.
Right.
So I'd say content writing is a pretty high volume. So it's hard to say.
Right. Yeah. Let's speak a little bit more about some of the advancements we've seen in machine translation in general. To be honest, lately, it seems like maybe like 2019, 2018 era, a lot of the research that would get published would get benchmarked on translation tasks. It was a really popular space in research. Now more and more we're seeing like big model launches and stuff getting more of the attention. Where is the state of machine translation now? What are some exciting things that have happened over the last couple of years?
Okay. Yeah, so I think that quality prediction was obviously, what we do was a big one, because it sort of allows buyers with high value content to finally take advantage of the advances, whereas before they really weren't getting any, benefit. But the other thing that I think is interesting is kind of this idea of like adaptive translation, what's called adaptive machine translation. And this is something that, GPT model makes much easier, which is, hey, I'd really like my translation, that's generated by AI to be informed by the previous segment, how I translated the line before it, maybe an image. All of these things should be inputs. And like I was saying with search, the technology to do this was always there, but now it became, not easy to build, but easier to build. And so to me, it's just ridiculous, right? You go to, translate.google.com and it is really one of the best for the most languages and so on. So nothing against Google, right? But you go there and you type, Palo Alto, and it translates as Palo Alto, and you type, Mountain View, and it says Vista de la Montaña, right? And it's like, in that context, you can't tell me we don't have AI that knows that, that's not how to translate. So those kind of things are going to change. To be honest, I'm often too early. So I thought like 2015, I'm like, surely they're going to fix this. 2018, surely they're going to fix this. And like now it's going to be pretty damn embarrassing if they don't, because, people, the new baseline became ChatGPT, and ChatGPT doesn't do that.
Right. How much have these foundation models been integrated into translation systems?
I can't say. Because I'm not inside, and if I knew something, I wouldn't be allowed to say it. But I think that's something you can depend on, right? Which is those teams are very optimized for the translation task. And as soon as something makes sense with a little bit of lag, because it has to be at a massive scale, they will incorporate those things. So I think it's fair to say that Microsoft, Google, and so on are all working on it.
But sometimes, like you mentioned, if you give GPT some translation task, it'll do it better than Google Translate. Right. And Google has foundation models that can compete with the large with GPT-4 and stuff. The question arises, why haven't they already implemented? For some cases, like we don't know what they have or haven't done, but it's just some of the quality is so poor that it seems obvious that they haven't. Is it largely a cost thing? Like, is the inference that they would have to run on it just too costly that they wouldn't?
There's that. There is cost, but there's also just engineering. So just imagine the scale that Google Translate runs at, right? So that every time somebody anywhere in the world opens his or her phone in a language and on a page and that's in a language he or she doesn't understand, which is most of the pages, this thing fires, right?
Yeah.
So they have to think about the costs. If you told somebody at Google or Microsoft, hey, this will hurt quality 5%, but it's going to cut costs by 50%, they'd say, sounds like a good trade to me.
Yeah, I mean, OpenAI has 100 million monthly, weekly active users. So we've now scaled that, and they have huge issues with like server load and stuff. Scale that to Google scale, and I understand why they won't do it.
Again, roughly 4 billion people, have an Android phone and can't understand English.
That's quite a big jump from 100 million. Yeah, it'd be nice to have like a paid tier though, like a Google Translate Plus or something. That's
Sure. I'm sure they're working on it.
I'm sure they are.
You listen to a recent talk I just spoke at the American Machine Association for the Machine Translation in Americas. And the keynote was from Christian Federmann at Microsoft, and he was very open about the fact that they're doing this, and when a paradigm shift like this comes along, then that it reaches a point where even if it's doing worse today, it makes sense for them to invest in it. And
for sure.
I can't remember if he said exactly, but you can understand that they've reached that point for this, and they're working on it.
Yeah, for sure. Let's speak a little bit about sort of lower resource languages. I know there's been some work done recently to improve the quality of lower pair data sets that have less language pairs in them, so Armenian to English translation or English to German, etc., and get higher quality results than in the past. Can you tell us just where we're at with that and what to expect?
I would say that what we typically thought of as low resource languages are not really low resource languages anymore. So, for example, like Chinese, not a low resource language, right?
Was it ever?
It was almost put in that bucket because it was exotic, and so you had to have different parsers, and you had poor support for a lot of stuff, right? Japanese, Chinese, and so on. And we still get those questions all the time, like, does it support those languages, right? Because people don't understand fairly from experience that these days it's the amount of data that matters, and the characters don't matter, right? Then another bucket, I would put something like Armenian. I would put that actually in the mid-resource bucket. And the reason Armenian, it's Wikipedia number 30, right? So you have a similar thing with like Catalan or something, right? Where, with a lot of work, you can actually make your language to be more present on the internet. And where I always noticed the huge lag was when the language itself was not well defined. So Armenian is pretty nicely defined. Of course, you have the two types. Basically, if you see something in the Armenian script, it's Armenian. Right.
It's not like Cyrillic.
It's not like Cyrillic. It's not like the Arabic alphabet or something like that, right? And I think the contrasting case would always be Kurdish, right? So I'm going to say, 30 million speakers or something on that order of magnitude, but it's split between these different. It's actually not a language. It's a few languages. They're quite different from each other. Then they're using really three different alphabets: Arabic alphabet, Latin alphabet, and then also Cyrillic. For example, here in Armenia, you go to a Yazidi village and it's in Cyrillic, right? So that really held them back because somebody at Microsoft or Google, or it doesn't have to be for translation, but it could be for like BERT or Llama or whatever. They go look at this and they say, okay, can we add this language? Nope. And they throw up their hands, right? Because it's too complicated.
Right.
So those languages got held back, I would say.
What about in terms of like how those language pairs are languages that in the past have had struggles with like just not enough data to get high quality machine translation on it? How's the quality of that been improved? Yeah,
I think one way to look at it, and I'm also the founder of the Machine Translate Foundation, and we had a meetup on low resource languages, and the fellow heading research at Facebook, which I think Facebook's probably ahead on the low resource languages, right? Because of the thing, the way that they use machine translation. The fellow who heads it is Paco Guzman, and I asked him there, if you take a low resource language today, is it better than a high resource pair like English to Spanish in, let's say, 2010? And he said, absolutely.
Interesting.
Yeah. And that makes sense to me.
Yeah.
Right? So they're better than the high resource languages were 10 years ago.
That's an interesting comparison. While we're on the subject of research, is the work that ModelFront is doing, these systems that you guys are building, could it be aided in improving just the actual fundamental models that we deploy for machine translation?
It could be. I think having something that says if a translation is good or bad is fundamentally very useful for training a better machine translation. You know about generator discriminator models and so on. But the most interesting thing, I think, is about having more content in those languages. So most of the languages have almost nothing. And, you know, I just take something like, I don't know, some talk with Mark Andreessen or some news clip from yesterday or any, you know, all sorts of high value content. You don't have it in German or Spanish, let alone Armenian, let alone Kurdish, right?
Yeah.
So really quality prediction, like the work we're doing at ModelFront, is what's finally allowing a much higher volume of things to be translated at quality.
Which is important, right?
So basically at Google, a small part of an effort that ultimately made bad translation free for most of humanity. Most of humanity now has an Android phone. And at ModelFront, we're making good translation, not free, but radically more efficient.
Right.
And which ultimately results in the distributors and creators of that content translating more of it at high quality, whereas today they just can't afford to in many cases.
And then the creators of machine translation models can take that data and improve their models with it, so that it's like a loop. Right?
That's a tricky thing. We already had the problem going back 10 years ago, 15 years ago, that the internet was polluted with all sorts of stuff. And so that was a problem for translation back then. And actually one of the things that Google became very good at was like detecting at least their own machine translations out there on the internet and avoiding training on them. And now we're going to have that problem, not just with translation, but with content in general, because, you know, all this AI generated content is going to be out there. Yeah. So I don't necessarily have a solution for that, but I actually think that's creating a ceiling that maybe people don't understand, where again, if you look at translation, we hit this problem more than 10 years ago. And now folks are going to very soon hit this problem with something like GPT, where training on the internet all of a sudden isn't the best idea anymore.
Because the quality of the data has depleted.
You're basically ingesting your own model output.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of interesting work to be done and a lot of opportunities in creating like really strong data engines, like synthetic data generation systems that produce really high quality data for training these models. So actually, surprisingly, like Microsoft is really running away with that space, it seems. And it seems like we might, there's some stuff in the news about maybe there'll be a breakthrough we'll know about soon on that front. But on that topic, I can't let you go without asking about all the crazy things that happened over the last week or 10 days, 2 weeks now, I guess. We're recording this at the end of November. We just had a big sort of boardroom battle at OpenAI, arguably the most important AI company in the world. And we don't know all the details, but it seems like the core of it was this accelerationist versus decelerationist sides of AI progress. One side advocating for taking a pause, maybe stopping certain research directions, and the other side being a bit more aggressive. Where do you fall on this?
Well, if I look at it from the translation perspective, I mean, you know, we build these models and we understand these models, and I'm not worried about it, right? It is fundamentally a tool. It's a technology. It's based on mathematics and so on. As I said, our mission is to have more content in more languages for more people.
Right.
To me, it's a sort of like typical thing. You have, 6 billion people around the world who don't understand English, and they don't really have a voice in this conversation. They would like that their kids can learn programming like your kid can, and all of these things, right? And then you have somebody in a country that, thanks to lots of hard work and technological advances and so on, became wealthy to the point that there are a lot of people with luxury beliefs out there who want to like sort of freeze everything, right? And they don't care that there's another 6 billion people on Earth who don't have access to the same things they do, right? And so, yeah, to me, I mean, anyone who sort of lived in next to socialism, under socialism, or in a post-socialism society understands how damaging that is, and has no nostalgia or illusions about sort of stopping progress. And the other thing, of course, is that, you can, even if, let's say, rogue folks inside the US, inside Silicon Valley, inside the OpenAI board manage to kill this one company, competitors to the West are not going to slow down.
Right.
This is going to be like nuclear power, right? Where, the West sort of scares itself into shutting things off. And meanwhile, go look at where the next 100 power plants are being built,
Right.
and they're not in countries that love America.
Right. Yeah, it's a good interesting
or
analogy.
Armenia.
Yeah. In terms of making sure that things move forward, I think this one boardroom, as important of a company as OpenAI is, this one boardroom battle wouldn't have slowed down the development of AI anyways, even in the US. How do you look at the sort of open source versus closed models debate? Do you think we'll get to a point where most companies will adopt sort of the meta philosophy of the way forward is having open models be released, and then you just serve those up as endpoints to run their business? Or do you think we'll continue in this way of closed source? Do you think there's going to be a winner that emerges between those? Because the open source models are still quite behind the closed source ones.
I would say maybe that's already happened to some degree, or that we're sort of at this 50-50 thing, and there will always be a tension between closed source and open source. I think what people probably generally don't appreciate, take machine translation, Google has basically been open sourcing everything, continuously since neural machine translation. The core algorithmic part, right? BERT was open source.
Publishing and
yeah, I mean, it's in a GitHub repo
right.
and so on. The sec to sec, right? It's all there. I think the thing that people don't appreciate around any type of production system at scale is, all the stuff around the data and the data cleaning and the inference and so on, and having a team carrying pager, right? These are processes almost, institutions, and that is hard to share outside. And so in some sense it has happened that the models are shared, but it doesn't mean you can go clone these systems, because
right.
what makes a system run involves a lot of other know-how. Yeah.
And resources
Also. Yeah. Right. And I mean, you would not want to run your own Google Translate, right? You're never going to do it cheaper than they can do it for you.
Yeah, that's for sure. And let alone building it from scratch.
So you have to have some other reason, whether it's security or customization, to run your own machine translation system locally.
Adam, last question. Where do you hope to see ModelFront in 5 years?
So I hope that in more or less we're sort of the Google Translate of quality prediction, right? So, people can love to hate us, so to speak, but they use us. But it becomes something that's very available, accessible, and that we make translation ultimately work way more efficiently, that we accelerate this task. The jobs are not going to go away. There's just infinite content to translate, and lots of demand from the other side, right? And so really hope to lead this wave as we have been so far.
Yeah. Wish you a lot of luck with that, and I hope you'll come back to share the story of how it goes. Thank you, Adam.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.